Hello, we're team number 4 and we're going to talk about international monetary systems. As an introduction, we have to say that exchanges and currencies have always been present in our societies through the centuries, but in their recent history, 19th and 20th century, has been full of changes and movements that are affecting us as a society. So it's crucial for us to know that history in order to understand why are we in this situation right now. Before we start, we should make sure that we understand some concepts. For example, first, the international monetary system refers to an institutional arrangement that governs exchange rates. Second, when the foreign exchange market determines the value of a currency, we say that a country is adhering to a floating exchange rate regime. And third, a pegged exchange rate means that the value of the currency is fixed relatively to a reference currency, which for example in our days it would be the US dollar. Still, other countries have operated with a fixed exchange rate, in which the values of a set currency are fixed against each other in some mutually agreed of exchange rate. And right now, everything is regulated by the IMF, in Spanish it would be Fondo Monetario Internacional, and the World Bank, El Banco Mundial. So those two organizations are key for understanding the exchange and paying processes in the world we currently live in.
Why most currencies are compared to dollars? How powerful are our currencies? Does gold actually matter? Today, we will learn all of those things by observing the history of international monetary systems. The first internationally recognized monetary system was established during 1803 until 1873, namely the bimetallism standard. This standard defined a nation's monetary unit in terms of fixed quantities of gold and silver. It was used when France issued a law of locally used bimetallism for its economics in 1803, and then followed by other European countries in later years. However, each nation could independently set its own rate of exchange between the two metals. This fact led to a classical problem in international use that the resulting rates often differ wildly from country to country. In order to overcome this problem, France, alongside with Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland formed the Latin Monetary Union in 1865 as an attempt to implement the system in a worldwide scale. In the following years, about 20 nations has agreed to join the union. Bimetallism provided a free and unlimited market for gold and silver, imposed no restrictions on the use and coinage of either metal, and made all other money in circulation redeemable in either gold or silver. The system was preferable to monometallism since the combination of two metals provides greater monetary reserves and price stability. It is also easier to determine and stabilize the exchange rates among countries using gold, silver, or bimetallic standards. Nevertheless, the process in mining, handling, and coinage was costly. The amount of demand and supply of the metals was changed over time, but the ratio of the price between both metals still the same. The condition could disrupt the double standard. Finally, the International Monetary Conference held in Paris in 1867 decided to terminate the use of this standard and replace it with a gold standard. The system gradually came to an end with the Franco-German War in the 1870s.
Next, let's talk about the gold standard. After the breakup of the bimetallism regime, gold came up as the next standard of the monetary system. Gold coins circulated as domestic currency alongside coins of other metals and notes, with the composition varying by country. In 1821, the UK used this standard early and then reached economic and political dominance in the 1870s. This dominance attracted other countries to enter London's financial markets. Fast forward to the end of the Franco-German War, Germany extracted reparations from France to facilitate a move to the gold standard. Meanwhile, recent gold discoveries in Western North America had made gold more plentiful. The impact of these events encourages many countries to turn into the gold standard. During the gold standard era, domestic currencies were freely convertible into gold at a fixed price with no restrictions. The exchange rates between participating currencies were also fixed, since each currency has a fixed ratio in terms of gold. Moreover, this standard limited the power of governments to issue paper currency, which could lead to price inflation. It also created certainty in international trade by providing a fixed pattern of exchange rates. The gold standard may not provide enough flexibility in the supply of money due to the irrelativity between the supply of newly mined gold and the growing needs of the world economy. It also prohibited any country to isolate its economy from the inflation or depression. These disadvantages caused the fall of the system along with the beginning of World War I in 1914. The anchored dollar standard. During the World War, gold flooded the US economics as a result of ammunition trading with Europe. After the war in 1918, the lack of gold supplies brought Europe into a financial crisis. Meanwhile, the US monetized gold, which doubled the prices. The US dollar became the only major currency and the global economy turned unstable within the gold standard, which led to the US dollar becoming the new international standard. This implies that the US economy expanded rapidly during the 1920s and even doubled between 1920 and 1929. In 1924, Germany went back to gold in its stabilization plan to stop its hyperinflation, followed by Britain in 1925, France in 1926, and several other countries. This condition resulted in excess demand for gold, causing deflation in major global economics. Meanwhile, in America, the stock market reached its peak in 1929. However, production declined, unemployment had risen, wages were low, food prices fell, and banks had an excess of large loans that could not be liquidated. Investors started to sell their overpriced stocks, which led to the stock market crash. The world faced the Great Depression during 1929 until 1939. Britain adopted gold in 1931, followed by America in 1933 after devaluing the dollar.
So the Tripartite Monetary Agreement was established in 1936, creating a new kind of dollar standard, but the dollar was the only currency anchored to gold, and all other countries in the system kept their respective currencies pegged to dollar only, and the system lasted during 1936 to 1971. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the US, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan after the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. The chief features of the Bretton Woods system were an obligation for each country to adopt a monetary policy that maintained its external exchange rates within 1% by tying its currency to gold, and the ability of the IMF to bridge temporary imbalance of payments. Also, there was a need to address the lack of cooperation among other countries and to prevent competitive devaluation of the currencies as well. On 15 August 1971, the United States unilaterally terminated convertibility of the US dollar to gold, effectively bringing the Bretton Woods system to an end, and rendering the dollar a fiat currency. At the same time, many fixed currencies, such as the pound sterling, also become free-floating. After the collapse of the Smithsonian Agreement, the major currencies of North America, Europe, and Japan floated. During the 1970s, the dollar depreciated from inflation and then commenced its dramatic ascent, following the 1979-80 Volcker shock, when US interest rates were hiked to unprecedented levels. By 85, the dollar strength was harming US competitiveness, prompting the US, Japan, Germany, France to sign the Plaza Accord, under which they jointly intervened to lower the dollar. And their intervention was so effective that they had to sign another agreement in 1987, the Louvre Accord, to stop the further fall of the dollar. Prior to these meetings, free-floating exchange rates were considered the best, but thereafter, the major countries began to cooperate more. Managed exchange rate. The European Monetary System, or EMS, was created by France and Germany in 1979 to resolve these deficiencies. Participating currencies were still held within their bilateral margins of 2.25%, but were now accompanied by capital controls to allow a degree of monetary policy autonomy. More importantly, a new entity, the European Monetary Fund, was established to provide credits known as ICES to members experiencing balance of payment problems. In practice, the EMS was a Deutschmark-centered system, with German monetary policy serving as the nominal anchor. Other countries reduced their inflation towards Germany, which was the lowest in Europe, and this time, none of the participants had to withdraw, and a far greater degree of exchange rate stability was achieved, and particularly after 1985.
From 2004, economists such as Michael P. Dooley, Peter M. Garber, and David Folkers Landau begin writing papers describing the emergence of a new international system involving an interdependency between states with generally high savings in Asia, lending and exporting to Western states with generally high spending. Similar to the original Bretton Woods, this included Asian currencies being pegged to the dollar, though this time by the unilateral intervention of Asian governments in the currency market to stop their currencies appreciating. The developing world as a whole stopped running current account deficits in 1999, widely seen as a response to unsympathetic treatment following the 1997 Asian financial crisis. From 2004, this supposed new Bretton Woods was called for the elimination of the structural imbalances that underlie it, namely the chronic US current account deficit. In conclusion, while most of us compare our currencies to the dollar, there is no way we're going back to bimetallism. Unless you want to go back to the 18th century.
As a first topic, we're going to talk about the gold standard. The gold standard had its origin in the use of gold as a medium of exchange, which was in the ancient history, but it started as a concept more seriously in the 1870s and 1880s, with pegging the currencies of powerful countries like Great Britain, the United States, Japan, and Germany with gold. The fact that this standard was created was because the most world trading nations, like the ones I've mentioned before, were going to get easier to trade with this standard because each one's currency was going to be pegged to the gold. That means that in that time, for example, $1 was defined as 23.22 grains of fine gold, and the British pound was valued at 113 grains of fine gold. So this means that if we calculate, 1 pound was the same as $4.87. Also, the amount of a currency needed to purchase 1 ounce of gold was called gold per value. The gold standard worked really well from its beginning in the 1870s and 1880s until the beginning of the First World War, which was in 1914. Then was when the countries abandoned it, because they were more focused on making more technology for their war equipment, and they were more focused on the technologies they were building. So during the war, they also started printing more money, which resulted in inflation, so that in the end of the war, they ended up having prices that were as higher as they had never been before. And this resulted into another income to the gold standard. The United States returned to it in 1919, Great Britain in 1925, and France in 1928. So after this, the European civilization's mentality towards the gold standard began to decline, and this led to the United Kingdom leaving the gold standard again in 1931. Then the United States followed and left it in 1933, and other European countries started to lift it also there. By the start of World War II, the gold standard was already dead. Now, as a second topic, we're going to talk about the Bretton Woods system. In 1944, when the Second World War was about to end, 44 representatives from different countries got together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new monetary system that would try to avoid the same final that gold standard had. The main goal from the Bretton Woods system would be to facilitate the post-war economic growth, and in order to reach this goal, they would create two different organizations, the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. First, we're going to talk about the role of the IMF. The Bretton Woods Agreement, of which the IMF was the main custodian, was to avoid the repetition of chaos through the combination of two things, discipline and flexibility. These two were the main values the IMF was going to put practice. First, the discipline, which was done in two ways. First, the need to maintain a fixed exchange rate puts a brake on competitive devaluations and brings stability to the world trade environment. And also, second, a fixed exchange rate regime imposes monetary discipline on countries, thereby curtailing price inflation. Now, talking about flexibility, the Bretton Woods Agreement also thought that it would be a great idea to add this value as a counterposition of the discipline, because they thought that the rigid policies from the gold standard was one of the main reasons why they had failed. Now talking about the World Bank, its official name is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and its main goal when it was created was to help the countries that were affected by the Second World War. But that's something that the United States did with the Marshall Plan. So they changed their goals and they changed it to development and began lending money to third world nations.
My name is Armando and I will go to talk about
the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system.
To know why it broke this system, we have to know that the dollar was a unique currency that could be able to change for gold, and that any pressure on to devalue the dollar could break with the system, and that is what happened. And the worsening of the foreign trade position of the United States led to speculation in the foreign exchange market that the dollar would devalue. Let's come ahead when in the spring of 1971, for the first time since 1945, the United States imported more than in export. Massive purchase of German mark in the foreign exchange market. On May 4 of 1971, the Bundesbank had to buy $1 billion to keep the dollar Deutsche market rate at its rate to fixed exchange rate, given the high demand for German marks. On the morning of May 5, the Bundesbank bought another $1 billion. In the weeks after the decision to float the Deutsche Mark, the currency market became increasingly convinced that the dollar would have to devalue. The President Richard Nixon announced in August of 1971 that the dollar could not be able to change for gold. After a massive quantity of specialization in February of 1973, culminating in European central banks spending $3.6 billion on March 1 to try to prevent the currency from appreciating against the dollar. The currency market was closed. The global monetary system continued to peg its currency to the dollar, and many do to this day. At the time, the switch to a floating system was a temporary response to unmanageable speculation in the currency market. More than 90 years have passed since the Bretton Woods system collapsed, and the temporary solution seems permanent. Okay, and now I will go to talk about
the floating exchange rate
the floating exchange rate regime that followed the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system was formalized in January 1975, when IMF members met in Jamaica and agreed to the rules for the international monetary system that are in place today, the Jamaica Agreement. The Jamaica meeting revised the IMF Articles of Agreement to reflect the new reality of floating exchange rates. The main elements of the Jamaica Agreement include that floating rates were declared acceptable, and for me the main importance that the gold was abandoned as a reserve asset. Exchange rates since 1973. Since March 1973, exchange rates have become much more volatile and less predictable than they were between in 1945 and 1973. This volatility has been partly to a number of unexpected shocks to the world monetary system, including the oil crisis in 1973, the oil crisis in 1979, the partial collapse of the European monetary system in 1992, and the global financial crisis in 2008. Now, in this graphic that you can watch in your screen, you can see all the change that the dollar has had. And now I going to tell you not the more important, because all are important, but I will tell you for me was the more, not the more important, but yes, that the more interesting change. Yes, that. In 1980, the dollar increased in value when the United States had a large and growing trade deficit. The United States imports more than it exports. But what happened then? A strong economic growth in the United States attracted significant capital inflows from foreign investors, and at the same time, the relatively slow economic growth in developed countries in Europe helped create the view that the United States was a good place to invest. These capital inflows increased the demand for the dollar in the markets.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Mendoza, and I'm going to talk about the fixed versus floating exchange rates. Well, in this section, we will review the arguments in favor of fixed and floating exchange rates regimen, and also the arguments in favor of floating rates. First, the case for floating exchange rates. The case in support of floating exchange rates has three main elements: monetary policy autonomy, automatic trade balance adjustment, and economic recovery following a severe economic crisis. The first one is monetary policy autonomy. It is argued that under a fixed system, a country's ability to expand or contract its money supply as it sees fit is limited by the need to maintain exchange rate parity. Monetary expansion can lead to inflation, which puts downward pressure on a fixed exchange rate. Proponents of a floating exchange rate regime argue that removing the obligation to maintain the exchange rate that will return monetary control to the government. If a government facing unemployment wants to increase its money supply to stimulate domestic demand and reduce unemployment, it could do so without the need to maintain its exchange rate. Although monetary expansion could lead to inflation, its exchange rate, although monetary expansion could lead to inflation, this will lead to a depreciation of the country's currency. I'll continue with balance of trade adjustments. Okay, under the Bretton Woods system, if a country developed the permanent deficit in its balance of trade, importing more than it exported, that could not be corrected by domestic policy. This will require the IMF to agree to a currency devaluation. And finally, the crisis recovery. Proponents of floating exchange rates also argue that exchange rate adjustment can help a country cope with economic crisis. When a country is hit by a severe economic crisis, its currency often falls on the foreign exchange markets. This is because investors respond to the crisis by taking their money out of the country, selling the local currency and lowering its value. At some point, however, the currency becomes so cheap that it begins to stimulate to export. Now, the case for fixed exchange rates. The case for fixed exchange rates rests on arguments about monetary discipline, speculation, uncertainty, and the lack of connection between the trade balance and exchange rates. Okay. First, the monetary discipline. While advocates of floating rates argue that each country shall be able to choose its own inflation rate, advocates of fixed rates argue that governments too often give in political pressures and expand the money supply too quickly, leading to unacceptably high price inflation. Now we have speculation. Critics of the floating exchange rate regime also argue that speculation can cause fluctuations in exchange rates. They point to the rapid rise and fall of the dollar during the 1980s, which they argue had nothing to do with comparative inflation rates and the US trade deficit, but with speculation. Those advocates of a fixed exchange rate regime argue that this system will limit the destabilizing effect of speculation. Then we have uncertainty. They argue that a fixed exchange rate, by eliminating such uncertainty, promotes the growth of international trade and investment. Proponents of a floating system respond that the forward foreign exchange market insures against the risk associated with exchange rate fluctuations, thus overstating the adverse impact of uncertainty of the growth of international trade and investment. Finally, we have the trade balance adjustment and economic recovery. Those in favor of floating exchange rates argue that they help adjust trade imbalances and can contribute to economic recovery after a crisis. Critics question the close relationship between the exchange rate, trade balance, and economic growth. They claim that trade deficits are determined by the balance between saving and investment in a country, not by external value of its currency. They argue that the depreciation of a currency will lead to inflation. And then we have a question: who's right? Which side is right? And this intense debate between those in favor of a fixed exchange rate and those in favor of a floating exchange rate. Economics do not agree. But in the following section discusses possible models of such a system and problems they raise. And the topic is exchange rate regimens in practice. So now governments around the world apply a number of different exchange rate policies. These range from pure free floating, where the exchange rate is determined by market forces, to a pegged system that has some aspects of the pre-1973 Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system. In this section, we examine in more detail the mechanisms and implications of the exchange rate regimens that are based on currency peg or target zone. Well, the first one is fixed exchange rates. In a fixed exchange rate regime, a country pegs the value of its currencies to that of major currency so that, for example, when the US dollar appreciated in value, its own currency also rises. Fixed exchange rates are popular with many of the world's smaller nations, as with a full fixed exchange rate regime. The great virtue claim for a pegged exchange rate is that it imposes monetary discipline on a country and leads a low inflation. And finally, we have currency boards. In this regime, the currency board can only issue more national bills and coins when there are foreign exchange reserves to back it up. This limits the government's ability to print money and thus create inflationary pressures in a strict currency board system. Interest rates are adjusted automatically. If investors wants to exchange domestic currency for say US dollars or something, the supply of domestic currency will be reduced, and this will cause interest rates to rise until it eventually becomes attractive for investors to hold their local currency again.
International Monetary System is an organization composed of 184 countries that work to promote world monetary collaboration, facilitate international trade, promote a high level for employment and economic growth. Okay, a number of times financial crises have occurred over the past 30 years, many of which have recorded IMF involvement. Currency increase occurs when speculative attack on the exchange value a currency resulted in the sharp depreciation in the value of the currency. In the following video, he is about Asian financial crisis.
The Asian financial crisis of 1997. There was an overheating of the economy, and the rapidly growing Southeastern Asian countries formed a bubble. The bubble burst on July 1997. It was known as the Asian financial crisis of 1997. This crisis began in Thailand after the Thai baht, which is Thailand's currency, collapsed. Thailand had a huge foreign debt and was bankrupt. There were fears of the financial contagion spreading worldwide. It did. The crisis spread through the rest of the region, and other countries of Southeast Asia saw their stock markets fall. Indonesia, South Korea, and Thailand were the most affected. The rest of the countries were less affected, but they all experienced a fall in demands. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or what is known as the ASEAN, had a debt of 180% in the worst part of the crisis. But what went wrong? Were they victims of their own success? The most affected countries by the Asian financial crisis were Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia. In Thailand, its economy was growing very fast, on an average of 9% per year, while the inflation kept somewhat stable. However, on May 14th, the Thai baht was greatly hit by speculative attacks. What started the crisis was the government's failure to react and defend the baht. Thailand's economic prosperity ended, and the baht lost more than half of its value, as the Thai stock market dropped 75% and the devaluation of the baht dropped by 20%.
Powerful for the IMF or any government to contain. In late 1997, contagion reached Korea, one of the most successful economies in the world.
Further on, in South Korea, the banking as there was excess debt due to non-performing loans and negatively expanding South Korean corporations, which further on increased the economic problems. For example, in July 1996, Kia Motors felt forced to ask for emergency loans.
It's unbelievable that the crisis has spread as quickly as to Indonesia and Korea within a matter of 6 months or 7 months. But the world was much more globalized than we thought it was at that time.
Lastly, by June 1997, Indonesia seemed to not be affected by the crisis. A low inflation, a great trade surplus, and a good banking sector placed Indonesia far from crisis. Many corporations had been borrowing US dollars, which was a good idea since the rupiah, Indonesia's currency, had strengthened. However, when the baht was attacked, the rupiah dropped. The IMF also had to intervene with a bailout package of $23 billion, but the baht kept on falling. In November 1997, it reached eventually the president Suharto resigned. Before the crisis, the exchange rate was about 2,600 rupiah to $1. After the crisis on January, it stood at 11,000 to $1. The crisis caused a loss of 13.5% of the country's GDP.
Crisis collapse, companies collapse, and in the case of Indonesia, the social fabric collapsed. Churches have been burned, mosques have been attacked. They have killed each other. And it's all the fallout of an economic collapse.
The crisis in Asia had many macroeconomic-based effects. The crisis had a great impact on the countries and left many of them in great damage. There was a reduction in the values of currencies and in the stock markets. Many businesses failed and collapsed. As a result, many people fell below the poverty line in 1997-1998. The crisis also led to a political upheaval. The economy started overheating, which increased demand, and as a result, investors didn't see the underlying weaknesses of the economies. After the crisis, GDP values decreased greatly. The nominal US dollar GDP of ASEAN fell by $9.2 billion in 1997 and by $218 billion in 1998. There was a 31.7% change in only 1 year. The nominal US dollar GDP per capita fell 42.3% in Indonesia in 1997, 21.2% in Thailand, 19% in Malaysia, 18.5% in South Korea, and 12.5% in the Philippines. Economists have been analyzing this crisis. The strategies used to restore confidence after the crisis were as follows. First of all, the monetary policy was established so that interest rates were manipulated. The fiscal policy took account of the costs of restructuring the banking system. Financial institutions that are insolvent were declared to be closed or bought by stronger ones. Lastly, political leaders should show.
The current system is a mixed system in which a combination of government intervention and speculative activity can drive the foreign exchange market. Companies engaged in significant foreign exchange activities need to be aware of this and adjust their foreign exchange transactions.